The Vanishing Library of Cluny. In the heart of Burgundy, France, stood the Benedictine Abbey of Cluny, once the intellectual lighthouse of medieval Europe. Founded in the year 910, Cluny was more than a monastery. It was a hub where manuscripts, chronicles, and letters were carefully copied, preserved, and circulated. At its height, Cluny's library may have rivaled the great collections of the ancient world, an organised treasure trove of theology, philosophy, law, music, and natural science. Yet, by the late Middle Ages, almost nothing remained. Today, only a fraction of its works survive, scattered in fragments across Europe. It is as though a medieval Alexandria had quietly burned, not with a single fire, but with centuries of deliberate neglect and, some argue, suppression. The mystery deepens when we examine the scale of the loss. Medieval sources describe row upon row of codices, manuscripts meticulously copied by generations of monks, but wars, fires, and the dissolution of monasteries in the early modern period supposedly explain their disappearance. Historians, however, have long wondered whether this was merely the result of chance, or if some of the library's more inconvenient works were quietly eliminated. After all, the abbots of Cluny had contacts stretching from Moorish Spain to Rome, and whispers persist that heretical commentaries, unorthodox histories, and scientific works, never aligned with official doctrine, may have been among the lost volumes. A curious detail survives. Certain medieval chronicles mention the books of heathens resting in Cluny's shelves. What precisely these books were remains a mystery. Some scholars speculate they may have included translations of Arabic works on astronomy or even fragments of lost classical texts. Others point to the possibility that reformist ideas, critical of church excess or monarchic overreach, were intentionally withheld from circulation. The silence surrounding what titles actually filled those shelves is perhaps the loudest clue we have. The destruction of Cluny itself was equally telling. The abbey was partly dismantled after the French Revolution, its vast stones sold off to build houses. But long before then, the catalogues of its library had already thinned. Unlike the Vatican Library or the archives of Toledo, which proudly boast their collection's survival, Cluny's legacy vanished in silence, without even a systematic catalogue to memorialise what was lost. That very absence feels deliberate, as if the erasure itself were meant to hide something larger. And so, we are left to imagine. Was Cluny simply another casualty of time, its manuscripts, worm-eaten, fire-touched, dispersed to careless nobles? Or were certain works deliberately culled, their voices scrubbed from the record to ensure Europe's official version of history carried forward unchallenged? Scholars still debate whether the abbey's disappearance was mere neglect or an orchestrated purge, a medieval cover-up wrapped in the guise of natural decay, Templar secrets buried. In the year 1307, a quiet October dawn broke over France with an ominous command. King Philip IV, deep in debt to the Knights Templar, ordered the arrest of every member of the order. What followed was one of the most infamous crackdowns of the Middle Ages. Knights dragged from their fortresses, accused of blasphemy, heresy, and unspeakable rituals. The trial records that survive paint a picture of grotesque confessions, men supposedly spitting on crosses, worshipping strange idols, and engaging in secret rites. Yet, as we peel back the layers, much of this narrative feels like carefully staged theatre. The true Templar archives, the Order's own records of their banking system, alliances, and perhaps their spiritual practices, vanished almost entirely. The suddenness of their fall is striking. The Templars had been more than warriors. They were Europe's first international bankers, safeguarding deposits, issuing credit, and transferring wealth across continents. Some medieval chroniclers hint that they held knowledge far beyond financial wizardry. Rumours swirl of documents smuggled from Jerusalem during the Crusades, scrolls from the Temple of Solomon itself, that may have influenced their spiritual practices. When Philip and Pope Clement V moved against them, those very records were never produced at trial, nor mentioned again in official sources. Did they vanish by accident, or were they hidden deliberately, spirited away before soldiers stormed Templar strongholds? One curious detail lies in the Chinon parchment, discovered only in 2001 in the Vatican's secret archives. It reveals that Pope Clement had quietly absolved the Templars of heresy, suggesting the trial was less about theology than about politics and money. If absolution was secretly granted, why allow their order to be dissolved and their leaders burned? The parchment's concealment, vosci des aemptos, or centuries, feels less like oversight and more like a controlled silence, keeping the papacy's complicity in a royal vendetta away from public scrutiny. The fate of the Templar treasure remains one of the most tantalizing mysteries. Chroniclers claimed wagons laden with gold left Paris the night before the arrests, never to be seen again. Others suggested ships sailed from La Rochelle, carrying secrets to Scotland or beyond. Whether these tales are myth or faint echoes of truth, the official records say little. Instead, silence reigns where clarity should have been, suggesting a cover-up that suited both monarchs and church alike. And yet, amid the smoke of executions and the ashes of burned knights, whispers of survival persisted. Scotland, Portugal, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire seemed curiously untouched by the purge, allowing Templar traditions to bleed into new orders like the Knights of Christ. Were these simply convenient rebrandings, or deliberate efforts to preserve something powerful, hidden from hostile eyes? Scholars still debate whether the real secret was a treasure of gold, a cache of sacred relics, or knowledge dangerous enough to destabilize the very foundations of medieval Christendom. Byzantine icon smashing. In the 8th and 9th centuries, the Byzantine Empire convulsed with a cultural earthquake that would later be softened into the neat label of iconoclasm. At its heart, the controversy revolved around images, painted saints, golden mosaics, and holy icons that adorned churches and palaces. The emperors Leo III and his son Constantine V insisted these images were idolatrous and ordered their destruction. For decades, soldiers stormed monasteries, smashing icons, burning scrolls, and stripping walls bare. Yet when the dust settled, Byzantine chroniclers framed this as a temporary theological debate, a mere footnote in the life of the Church. The scale of what was erased, however, hints at something far larger, an intentional cover-up of what early Christianity once looked like, and perhaps what it once believed. The images that did survive offer tantalizing glimpses. Some of the earliest Christian icons depicted Christ without a beard, Mary enthroned like an empress, and saints dressed in garments resembling philosophers rather than clerics. These styles hint at a faith still deeply intertwined with the Hellenistic world, not yet locked into the medieval patterns we now associate with Christianity. But the iconoclast emperors erased swathes of this heritage, ensuring that what remained aligned with their own orthodoxy. Later generations, forced to reconstruct the missing centuries of art, had to rely on works that survived only in remote monasteries beyond the reach of imperial soldiers. A curious thread lies in the role of the monks themselves. Many resisted the emperor's decrees, hiding icons in caves, burying them beneath monastery floors, or smuggling them into foreign lands. Stories of icons miraculously surviving fire or appearing in dreams may sound legendary, yet they preserve an echo of real desperation, the knowledge that something invaluable was being erased forever. How many theological treatises, how many artistic experiments, how many records of alternative Christian practices vanished with the sweep of a soldier's axe? Even more intriguing is the political backdrop. By rejecting icons, emperors positioned themselves as arbiters of religious truth, diminishing the independent power of monasteries and bishops. This was not only a war on images, but on memory itself. When later councils restored the veneration of icons in 843, the triumph of orthodoxy, the victory came with a rewritten history. The complexity of the iconoclast period was smoothed into a simple tale of misguided rulers corrected by holy tradition. Modern scholars continue to wrestle with the silence left behind. Were early Christian communities more diverse in practice than the later church admitted? Did images embody theological positions now forgotten, positions that might complicate the story of an unbroken orthodoxy? The smashed mosaics and lost manuscripts suggest they did. Scholars still debate whether iconoclasm was merely a policy of piety gone astray, or a deliberate effort to erase rival visions of Christianity from the historical stage. The lost coronation oath. Every medieval king claimed his legitimacy flowed from God, yet legitimacy was also bound to ritual. In England, one of the most crucial rituals was the coronation oath, a public promise made before clergy, nobles, and commoners alike. These oaths were not mere formalities. They outlined the responsibilities of the monarch, defending the church, upholding justice, and safeguarding the rights of the people. Yet as we move through the records of English coronations, especially before the 12th century, a troubling silence emerges. The exact wording of these early oaths is missing, obscured, or altered. What might have once been binding promises seem to have been reshaped or erased to suit the politics of each reign. Take the case of William the Conqueror in 1066. Sources tell us he swore to rule justly and protect the church, but the precise phrasing has never been preserved. Later chroniclers, writing under Norman influence, offered versions that conveniently emphasize obedience to royal authority. Was the original wording less flattering, perhaps containing obligations towards subjects that the Norman monarchy preferred forgotten? Similarly, Henry I's coronation charter of 1100, often celebrated as a proto-constitution, promised to abolish evil customs and restrain abuses of royal power. Yet, even here, the text feels curated, framed as a generous gift rather than a binding contract. What language may have been scrubbed away before the ink dried? The issue runs deeper when we consider the evolution of English law. Magna Carta, sealed in 1215, is often hailed as a revolutionary check on royal authority, but some historians argue it echoed earlier oaths, lost or deliberately hidden, that already placed limits on kings. If these earlier promises had survived in full, Magna Carta might not look like a radical departure at all, but rather the rest, oration of a tradition quietly buried. An odd detail comes from Archbishop Stigand, who supposedly crowned both Harold II and William the Conqueror. Contemporary accounts of these ceremonies are unusually vague, even evasive, compared to other chronicles of the period. Was this omission accidental or deliberate, ensuring that conflicting promises made in the chaos of 1066 could not be used to challenge Norman legitimacy? Later scribes, after all, worked under royal patronage, and a pliable memory of the past served the throne far better than a binding precedent. The silence around the coronation oaths leaves us with tantalizing questions. Were medieval kings bound by stronger moral contracts than we now assume? Did they swear to protect customs, lands, and freedoms that vanished from record because they were inconvenient? Scholars still debate whether the missing oaths are merely accidents of survival, or whether they were intentionally rewritten, a medieval cover-up ensuring that the king's promises faded into forgetfulness, leaving only his power behind. The Doctored Domesday Book. In 1086, William the Conqueror ordered the creation of one of the most extraordinary documents of the Middle Ages, the Domesday Book. It was essentially a nationwide audit of England, listing who owned what, how much land was under cultivation, how many mills and fisheries existed, even how many pigs rooted in the forests. To modern historians, It provides an unmatched window into the world of 11th century England. But the Domesday Book is also a puzzle, for its silences are as revealing as its entries. Some counties appear in painstaking detail, while others are curiously vague. Certain estates vanish altogether from record, as if they had never existed, and in more than one case, the records seem to have been altered to favour William's most loyal barons. The project was not simply administrative, it was political. William had seized the English throne by force in 1066, and 2 decades later his rule still faced resentment. The Domesday Survey allowed him to assert control over every acre of land, stripping Anglo-Saxon lords of their holdings and confirming Norman barons in their place. But this neat ledger of conquest was not always so neat. Later analysis has shown that entries were revised, sometimes squeezed in the margins, sometimes altered with different ink, suggesting that scribes went back to adjust ownership after disputes had already been settled. In other words, the Domesday Book was not a neutral census, but a political instrument tailored to legitimize Norman domination. A particularly curious omission lies in London. Despite being the kingdom's largest and wealthiest city, its details are missing from the main volume. Scholars puzzle over why. Did the city negotiate a separate charter to preserve its privileges, one the Crown preferred not to publicise, or was London's wealth too sensitive to record openly, risking unres, if its contributions appeared disproportionate? Either way, the absence feels deliberate, a hole in the record designed to shield power from scrutiny. The book's title itself hints at finality. Domesday, echoing the Last Judgment, implied its verdicts were unalterable, yet surviving drafts show that it was anything but. Corrections, glosses and contradictions reveal a living text that evolved over months of negotiation. In that evolution we glimpse the hand of politics, land quietly reassigned, numbers massaged, and responsibilities shifted to benefit the ruling elite. It raises the unsettling possibility that what we think of as the most reliable snapshot of medieval England is already doctored, more propaganda than raw fact. And yet, the Domesday Book endured. For centuries, English monarchs treated it as sacred truth, even when its gaps were obvious. To challenge it was to challenge the king himself. Scholars still debate whether its omissions reflect the accidents of a rushed survey or a calculated cover-up, ensuring that William's conquest looked orderly on parchment, even if it was anything but in reality. The phantom heirs of Charlemagne. When Charlemagne died in 814, he left behind not just a vast empire, but also a problem: succession. His grandsons eventually divided his territories, fragmenting the Carolingian realm into kingdoms that would later evolve into France, Germany, and beyond. Yet when we read the genealogies that survive from this period, something feels off. Names appear and disappear. Certain children are acknowledged in one chronicle, ignored in another, and a handful of heirs, sons and daughters mentioned in passing, seem to vanish from history altogether, their lines cut off in silence. It is as if the Carolingian dynasty, so obsessed with legitimacy, had deliberately edited its own family tree. The stakes were enormous. In the medieval world, a royal genealogy was more than a family record. It was a weapon. If a rival could prove descent from Charlemagne, they had a claim to his empire. Erasing inconvenient branches of the family tree meant eliminating threats before they arose. Some scholars point to Pippin, one of Charlemagne's grandsons, whose descendants are mentioned fleetingly in early sources, but later vanish, perhaps quietly absorbed into rival noble families. Were their claims deliberately obscured so later kings could rule without challenge? Curiously, certain medieval chroniclers hint at illegitimate heirs, children born outside official marriages who may have carried Carolingian blood. These figures appear in whispers, in monastic notes, in legal disputes, in hints of noble lines that sprang from imperial seed. Yet the main chronicles remain stubbornly silent. smoothing away the messy realities of dynastic politics. This silence is not unique to the Carolingians, but given Charlemagne's near-mythic status, the gaps feel calculated. To admit too many heirs was to weaken the carefully crafted image of a dynasty chosen by God. The erasures continued long after Charlemagne's immediate descendants. By the 12th century, when new dynasties like the Capetians in France claimed Carolingian descent, genealogies were polished to highlight neat, unbroken lines. Inconvenient cousins, rival branches, or disputed marriages simply vanished. One striking example comes from the so-called Chronicle of Saint Denis, which subtly reorders family relationships to present a smoother narrative of succession. What may look like sloppy scribal work could just as easily be deliberate political editing. And yet, tantalizing fragments survive in the margins. Some German noble families maintained private traditions that they were descended from forgotten sons of Charlemagne. Whether these were genuine memories or convenient inventions, they reveal how contested the imperial legacy remained. To be a phantom heir of Charlemagne was both a danger and an opportunity. Dangerous enough to be erased from chronicles, but tempting enough for later nobles to resurrect when claims of legitimacy were needed. Ultimately, the family tree of Europe's Father of the West may be less a natural record than a carefully pruned garden, shaped to secure thrones and silence rivals. Scholars still debate whether these missing heirs were truly forgotten through error or deliberately cut away in one of the Middle Ages' quietest cover-ups. The Hidden Crusade Failures. The Crusades are remembered through the lens of triumph and tragedy, holy wars that brought knights across continents, clashing with Islam for control of Jerusalem. Yet when we open the medieval chronicles, a curious pattern emerges. Victories are recorded in glorious detail, while defeats are either softened or erased altogether. It is as though entire armies could vanish from parchment simply because their failure was too embarrassing to admit. The official record became less a history of the Crusades than a curated story designed to uphold honour, faith, and authority. Consider the Second Crusade of 1147 to 1149. Launched with great fanfare and blessed by the Pope himself, it was led by none other than Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany. Yet when these kings marched into Anatolia, their armies were devastated, ambushed, starved, and reduced to shambles before they even reached the Holy Land. Chroniclers writing for royal courts glossed over the humiliations, framing the losses as minor setbacks in a noble endeavour. To admit the truth that two crowned monarchs had staggered home in disgrace would have undermined the very idea of crusading as a sacred mission. Another striking omission lies in the Crusade of 1101, a disastrous expedition launched shortly after the First Crusade. Thousands of knights were annihilated by Turkish forces in Anatolia, yet the campaign barely features in later European histories. To the chroniclers, it was easier to leap from the glories of 1099, when Jerusalem fell, to the challenges of later crusades, skipping entirely the humiliating defeats in between. Silence served the church and nobility far better than honesty. There were also hidden crusades against Christian heretics or political enemies, folded into the grand narrative as though they were part of the same holy struggle, the so-called Childre. En's Crusade of 1212, for example, was long treated as a pious legend, yet beneath the myth lies a story of exploitation. Thousands of poor, desperate youths lured into a doomed journey, many sold into slavery. Chronicles that admitted this failure did so cautiously, often reframing it as a moral allegory rather than a scandal. Others ignored it altogether, allowing the myth of childlike faith to eclipse the grim truth. The omissions reveal a broader pattern. Medieval chroniclers were not neutral observers, but participants in shaping collective memory. Crusading was not simply war, it was propaganda, a movement that depended on enthusiasm and faith. To maintain that enthusiasm, defeats had to be softened, buried, or excused as God's mysterious will, and yet cracks in the story survive. Eastern sources, especially Muslim historians like Ibn al-Athir, record the battles European writers preferred to forget, describing the routs and humiliations with brutal clarity. Cross-referencing these accounts exposes the selective silences of Western chronicles. Scholars still debate whether the gaps were merely patriotic exaggerations or a deliberate cover-up, ensuring that future generations remembered the Crusades not as a series of missteps but as a sacred epic of destiny, the suppressed plague origins. The Black Death of the 14th century was the deadliest pandemic Europe had ever known. Between 1347 and 1351, it is estimated to have killed nearly a third of the continent's population. Whole villages disappeared, cities emptied, and economies collapsed under the weight of death. Chronicles dwell on the horror, the plague carts, the ringing of bells, the silence of abandoned streets. Yet when it comes to the question of origins, the record grows strangely murky. Official narratives pinned the blame on vague eastern lands or on divine wrath, while carefully avoiding details that might implicate specific groups or policies. What we are left with feels less like ignorance and more like a medieval cover-up. Contemporary accounts suggest the plague first reached Europe through the Crimean port of Caffa in 1347, carried by Genoese traders fleeing a Mongol siege. Some stories even describe catapults hurling plague-ridden corpses over city walls, a chilling form of early biological warfare. Yet many Western chronicles omit these details entirely, preferring to frame the disease as an unstoppable act of God rather than a consequence of war and commerce. To acknowledge that trade routes, lifelines of wealth, were also conduits of death would have threatened the very foundations of Europe's prosperity. Even more troubling was the scapegoating. Jewish communities across Europe were accused of poisoning wells and spreading disease, leading to horrific massacres from Strasbourg to Mainz. The official records of these pogroms were often minimized or excised, reframed as spontaneous popular anger rather than systematic campaigns encouraged by civic leaders. To preserve social order, chroniclers preferred silence, turning mass violence into footnotes. Later generations would look back and see only fragments, the true scale of the tragedy hidden behind CES, annotated lines. There were also attempts to obscure the medical failures of the time. Physicians, tied to humoral theory, prescribed bleeding, herbs, and pilgrimages, none of which worked. Some chronicles downplay this, portraying doctors as noble martyrs who simply could not withstand God's will. Others inflate tales of miracle cures and relics, diverting attention away from the impotence of contemporary medicine. To admit ignorance too openly would have undermined the authority of both church and science. Curiously, Islamic chroniclers like Ibn al-Wadi and al-Makrizi provided more detailed descriptions of the plague's origins in Central Asia and its spread along caravan routes. Their works suggest a level of geographic awareness and epidemiological curiosity largely absent from Western accounts. By comparing the two traditions, historians can see the deliberate silences in European narratives. The Black Death was more than a biological catastrophe, it was a crisis of meaning. To control fear, authorities controlled the story, and so the official narrative became one of divine punishment, scapegoats, and vague geography, leaving the messy realities of warfare, trade, and social collapse hidden. Scholars still debate whether the suppression of origins was merely ignorance in a time of chaos, or a deliberate effort to protect powerful interests from blame, while rewriting the first draft of one of history's greatest tragedies. The disappearing women of power. When we picture medieval Europe, kings, knights, and abbots dominate the stage. Yet, beneath the surface, women held remarkable power. Queens who ruled in their own right, abbesses who commanded vast estates, noble women who defended castles, even merchants who controlled trade. And yet, when we turn to the chronicles, their names are often faint, their achievements blurred or erased. This wasn't simply neglect, it was often an intentional silencing, a rewriting of history that ensured power remained coded as male. Take Empress Matilda, daughter of Henry I of England. In the 12th century, she came within reach of the English throne, waging a civil war against her cousin Stephen. Contemporary writers describe her as proud, arrogant, and unwomanly, language that reveals as much about chroniclers' bias as her actual deeds. Later history softened her role, framing the conflict as Stephen's reign punctuated by unrest, rather than a near decade in which a woman nearly became England's rightful monarch. Her legacy was reduced to being the mother of Henry II, a safer, more acceptable memory than acknowledging her as a sovereign contender in her own right. The silencing extended into religious life. Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century abbess, mystic and composer, left behind a staggering body of writings on theology, medicine, and natural philosophy. Yet for centuries after her death, her works circulated in obscurity, sometimes stripped of her name. Others, like Hrotsvitha of Gandersheim, a 10th century playwright, were omitted from literary canons altogether until rediscovered in modern times. It is striking how quickly the voices of learned women could vanish, even when their works survived. Even in warfare, women appear at the margins. Chronicles of the Crusades occasionally mention queens like Melisenda of Jerusalem, who governed with intelligence and resolve. Yet her political manoeuvring was softened into the shadow of her husband's rule. Her actual leadership diminished to the role of consort. Similarly, Eleanor of Aquitaine's influence on the Angevin Empire was downplayed, with chroniclers far more interested in gossip about her marriages than her vast political acumen. A curious detail emerges when we compare Latin chronicles with local traditions. In Welsh and Irish folklore, powerful queens and warrior women stride across the landscape, their stories preserved in oral memory, even as Latin scribes omitted them. Could it be that medieval memory itself carried two layers, the official written record, shaped to marginalize women, and the unofficial oral record, which preserved their importance more honestly? The disappearance of women from medieval narratives was not inevitable. It was engineered. By downplaying female agency, chroniclers reinforced patriarchal structures, ensuring that memory aligned with power. What we now reconstruct comes from fragments, letters tucked in archives, marginal notes in manuscripts, folklore passed down outside the cloister. Scholars still debate whether the omission of women was unconscious bias or a deliberate cover-up, a quiet reshaping of the past to ensure that medieval history marched forward with men at the centre and women fading into the margins. The censored Icelandic sagas. On the windswept edge of medieval Europe, Iceland produced one of the richest bodies of literature in the Middle Ages, the sagas. These sprawling narratives told of Viking voyages, feuds, gods, and ghosts. Yet the sagas we have today are not raw pagan memories, but Christian-filtered versions, copied centuries after the events they describe. Beneath their surface lies a quiet cover-up, the deliberate reshaping of stories to align with new moral codes, trimming away elements that clashed with Christianity. The manuscripts themselves reveal the shift. Many of the sagas were written down in the 13th century, long after Iceland's official conversion to Christianity in the year 1000. By then, monks and clerics were the ones with the skill to preserve oral traditions. As they inked the stories, they subtly softened their pagan edges. Gods were demoted to trolls or evil spirits. Rituals became superstitions, and violent vengeance was often reinterpreted as sinful folly rather than heroic duty. What had once been sacred tales of Odin or Thor became cautionary parables, their theological power erased. Take the Völuspá, the great prophetic poem of Norse mythology. It survives in Christian-era manuscripts, yet parts of it bear curious interpolations. Scholars note that descriptions of Ragnarok, the doom of the gods, are framed almost like biblical apocalypse, with imagery reminiscent of Revelation. Was this simply coincidence, or a deliberate reframing of myth to align with Christian cosmology? Similarly, figures like Loki, once a trickster with complex roles, were painted more starkly as demonic, foreshadowing the devil. The censorship went beyond myth. The family sagas, recounting blood feuds and honour killings, often downplay the legitimacy of pagan law. Medieval scribes reframed vengeance as disorder, smoothing over the fact that for centuries, feud was the backbone of justice in Viking society. By reinterpreting it as barbarism, clerical scribes subtly justified the triumph of Christian courts. Yet fragments of the older tradition survive between the lines. Some sagas preserve poetic kennings, strange metaphorical phrases like whale road for the sea or battle sweat for blood, that carry echoes of pagan ritual language. Others hint at ceremonies that were half remembered, written down only because scribes failed to recognize their original religious meaning. It is as if two voices speak in the sagas, one ancient and pagan, the other medieval and Christian, locked in uneasy compromise. Modern scholars wrestle with the question, are the sagas reliable historical sources or literary inventions shaped by clerical pens? The answer lies somewhere in between. They are both memories and rewritings, testimonies of a lost world and its deliberate reshaping. Scholars still debate whether the censorship was conscious propaganda or the subtler work of scribes who could not help but filter the past through their own beliefs. Either way, the sagas as we know them are not simply Viking tales, they are medieval cover-ups, palimpsests, where whole worlds were erased and rewritten under the shadow of the cross, the forgotten Muslim scholars. When we imagine the intellectual flowering of medieval Europe, we often think of cathedrals, universities, and Latin manuscripts. Yet behind much of this learning lay a debt that official chronicles frequently obscured, the vast body of knowledge preserved and expanded by Muslim scholars. Between the 8th and 13th centuries, cities like Baghdad, Cordoba, and Toledo became centres of translation and innovation. Greek philosophy, Indian mathematics, and Persian medicine flowed through Arabic scholarship, only later filtering into Europe. And yet, when European chroniclers recorded their libraries or universities, these origins were often muted, the names of Muslim thinkers quietly trimmed away. Consider Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, whose canon of medicine became the standard textbook in European universities for centuries. Generations of physicians studied his theories, yet later chroniclers often presented them as extensions of Galen or Hippocrates, minimizing their Islamic transmission. Similarly, Al-Khwarizmi, the mathematician whose name gave us algorithm, introduced algebra as a distinct discipline. Yet medieval European manuscripts often transmitted his work anonymously, stripping away his authorship as though the ideas had simply emerged in Latin thought. The case of Toledo in the 12th century is especially telling. When Christian forces recaptured the city, they encountered a treasure trove of Arabic manuscripts. Translators like Gerard of Cremona rendered them into Latin, bringing Europe Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Arabic astronomy in new detail. But later chronicles highlighted the translators rather than the original authors, framing the knowledge as rediscovered by Christians rather than transmitted by Muslims. This subtle reframing allowed Europe to celebrate its Renaissance while downplaying the Islamic bridge that made it possible. There were also conscious erasures. The works of Averroes, Ibn Rushd, a philosopher from Cordoba, profoundly shaped medieval debates about faith and reason. His commentaries on Aristotle were hotly discussed in Paris and Bologna. Yet, as scholasticism matured, Averroes' name was increasingly sidelined, his arguments filtered through Christian thinkers like Thomas Aquinas. What had once been a vibrant engagement with Islamic philosophy became reframed as a purely European theological dispute. The silencing served political ends. By minimizing Muslim contributions, Europe could frame its intellectual blossoming as self-contained, a divine reward for Christian civilization. Acknowledging the depth of its debt would have complicated the narrative of conflict between Christendom and Islam, especially during the Crusades. Better to let the manuscripts stand as anonymous authorities than to admit that the enemy's scholars had once been teachers. And yet, traces survive. Marginal notes in Latin manuscripts occasionally preserve original Arabic names, hints of the scholars whose voices once guided European pens. In rare cases, bilingual glossaries reveal the process of translation, showing how ideas were reshaped in the crossing. These fragments remind us that beneath the smooth surface of European intellectual history lies a palimpsest of cultures, languages, and faiths. Scholars still debate whether the forgetting of Muslim scholars was the result of gradual neglect or an intentional cover-up designed to let Europe imagine itself as the sole heir to antiquity while quietly erasing the bridges that carried it there. The fabricated relics. The Middle Ages were awash with relics, bones of saints, splinters of the true cross, drops of Christ's blood, even feathers from the wings of angels. Cathedrals and monasteries competed fiercely to claim the most sacred objects, for relics drew pilgrims, and pilgrims brought wealth. Yet beneath the pious displays, a murkier reality lurked. Many of these relics were inventions, fabrications, or deliberate substitutions. And as chronicles praised their miraculous power, awkward details about their authenticity slipped quietly into silence. The case of the Shroud of Turin is perhaps the most famous, though its notoriety grew later. First recorded in France in the 14th century, the shroud appeared suddenly in the hands of a minor noble family. Local bishops quickly questioned its authenticity, pointing out inconsistencies in its provenance. Yet instead of condemning it outright, the Church permitted its veneration, carefully controlling the narrative. Doubts were muted, buried under the weight of devotion. The object's power lay not in its authenticity, but in its utility, drawing crowds and bolstering faith. Earlier examples abound. By the 12th century there were enough fragments of the True Cross scattered across Europe to build a ship, a fact noted wryly by critics even at the time. Yet cathedral inventories never addressed the duplication. Each fragment was framed as unique, each shrine legitimate, while the broader absurdity was politely ignored. Similarly, rival churches claimed to house the head of John the Baptist, or the body of Mary Magdalene. Chroniclers smoothed over the contradictions, preferring not to dwell on the impossibility of saints' bodies multiplying across the continent. Relics also served political ends. When Charlemagne wanted to legitimize his reign, he gathered relics from Rome and Constantinople, parading them before his people. Centuries later, French monarchs at Saint-Denis claimed possession of the crown of thorns, a relic whose authenticity was questioned even then. To challenge it, however, was to challenge royal authority itself. Better then for scribes to preserve reverent silence than risk undermining both faith and throne. A curious detail lies in the manufacture of relics. Pilgrims' badges, small pewter tokens sold as souvenirs, sometimes doubled as containers for contact relics, bits of cloth or dust that had supposedly touched a holy shrine. While many of these were openly commodified, some were elevated into relics themselves, their humble origins forgotten or concealed. Over time, the line between authentic and fabricated blurred so completely that even custodians of shrines may not have known the truth. The question of relics was never entirely uncontested. Skeptics like Erasmus in the Renaissance ridiculed the sheer number of duplicated saints' bones. Yet medieval chronicles rarely echoed such doubt. The silence itself was telling. Relics were too valuable to expose, their role in sustaining both piety and profit too great to risk by confessing their invention. And so the Middle Ages left us a paradox. Relics inspired genuine devotion, shaped the geography of pilgrimage, and filled Europe's cathedrals with awe. Yet many were, at their core, fabrications carefully protected by silence. Scholars still debate whether medieval believers were complicit in the illusion or victims of a deliberate cover-up that reshaped fragments of bone and cloth into the very cornerstones of faith, the erased Viking settlements. For centuries, the story of the Vikings ended neatly. Raiders and traders who plundered Europe, then vanished as Scandinavia converted to Christianity. Yet archaeology tells us otherwise. Across Greenland, Iceland, and even the shores of North America, Norse settlements left their traces: longhouses, iron nails, livestock bones, and runic carvings. But medieval chronicles, especially those penned in Europe, said little. The silence around these settlements was not accidental. It was, in many cases, a deliberate forgetting, as though the presence of Vikings in far-off lands disrupted the official narrative of Christendom's orderly expansion. The Greenland colonies, founded around 985 by Eric the Red, thrived for centuries. At their height, they supported churches, trade in walrus ivory, and even contact with Norway. Yet by the 15th century they disappeared, their fields empty, their churches abandoned. What happened? Climate change, soil exhaustion, and shifting trade patterns all likely played a role, but when European records mention Greenland at all, they speak vaguely of a lost land, as if it had slipped off the map. There was little effort to record why it vanished. To admit that Christian settlements could fail so utterly, swallowed by cold and isolation, was a truth medieval chroniclers preferred not to confront. Even more striking is Vinland, the mysterious land across the Atlantic, likely Newfoundland, where Leif Erikson's expedition established a short-lived settlement around the year 1000. The Icelandic sagas preserve tantalizing details: grapevines, fertile fields, hostile encounters with Skrælings. But outside of Iceland, medieval Europe remained silent. No continental chronicle recorded these voyages despite their significance. Was this ignorance or suppression? If monks reshaped Icelandic sagas to fit Christian morals, might they also have minimized the Vikings' discovery of lands across the ocean, a discovery that threatened to upend biblical geography and the idea of Europe's centrality? Curiously, fragments survive. In 1347, an Icelandic document notes a ship returning from Markland, thought to be Labrador. This suggests that contact with North America continued longer than sagas imply. Yet no great chronicler seized upon the detail. It lingered only as a clerical note, hidden from broader history. When Columbus set sail centuries later, Europeans proclaimed he had discovered a new world, forgetting or choosing to forget that the Norse had been there long before. The erasure may have been practical as well as ideological. With Greenland failing and Vinland abandoned, there was little incentive to preserve the memory of distant colonies that had not endured. Better to frame Viking history as ending in conversion and assimilation than to recall risky ventures that ended in silence. And so Viking settlements slipped into the margins, their memory preserved only in scattered sagas and archaeological remains. Scholars still debate whether this forgetting was simple neglect, or a deliberate cover-up, ensuring that Europe's great story of exploration began not with pagan sailors, but with Christian navigators, centuries later. The hidden plague accounts. When we think of the Black Death, the image is fixed. Mid-14th century Europe, carts piled with corpses, towns devastated by a disease that killed perhaps a third of the population. Yet this story is incomplete. There were earlier plagues, some equally catastrophic, that medieval records often concealed, minimized, or reshaped. By smoothing over the timeline of epidemic disease, chroniclers preserved the illusion of divine punishment at precise historical moments, rather than admitting a recurring vulnerability that threatened society far more frequently. The Justinianic plague of the 6th century, for example, decimated the Byzantine Empire, spreading across the Mediterranean and deep into Europe. Some estimates suggest it killed tens of millions. Yet when medieval chroniclers later told the story of their own centuries, this earlier pandemic was rarely acknowledged. The memory of it faded, as if admitting that plague was a recurring scourge undermined the claim that the Black Death was uniquely apocalyptic. Even within the 14th century, the record is selective. Many chronicles vividly describe the Black Death of 1347 to 1351, yet fewer mention the recurrent outbreaks that followed every decade for a century. In England, for instance, plague struck again in 1361, then repeatedly into the 15th century, killing generation after generation. And yet, these cycles are muted in the grand histories, which often frame the initial outbreak as a singular event, the Great Mortality. Was it because rulers preferred to narrate recovery and resilience rather than admit that the pestilence never truly ended? Another silence lies in the accounts of minority scapegoats. In many towns, Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells and deliberately spreading disease. Pogroms swept across Europe in 1348 to 1349, but in official chronicles these events are oft ensoftened or omitted. Royal records from the Holy Roman Empire, for instance, highlight measures against plague, but avoid detailed mention of massacres against Jews, as if to bury an uncomfortable truth about social violence committed under the shadow of pestilence. Equally intriguing are the scattered references to plague outside Europe. Chinese records suggest outbreaks of pestilence as early as the 1330s, and Middle Eastern chroniclers like Ibn Battuta allude to widespread disease. Yet when European chronicles present the plague, they frame it as an event erupting upon Christendom, largely disconnected from a wider world. The omission bolstered a worldview where disaster struck Europe in isolation, reinforcing the notion of divine chastisement rather than global contagion. A more peculiar silence concerns supposed cures and protective rituals. Some monasteries recorded bizarre remedies, carrying aromatic herbs, wearing amulets, even applying crushed emeralds to the skin. Others whispered of plague saints, whose relics could ward off infection. These details, while occasionally surviving in marginal notes, were often left out of polished chronicles. The custodians of written history preferred to stress moral lessons, sin, punishment, repentance, over practical, if desperate, attempts at survival. The result is that our image of medieval plague is both too sharp and too narrow. We see a single catastrophe where, in reality, there was a pattern of recurring epidemics, each reshaping society. Scholars still debate whether medieval chroniclers consciously covered up these repetitions, or whether collective trauma simply encouraged forgetting, as though silence itself could hold back the return of pestilence. The suppressed Crusader atrocities. The medieval Crusades were framed in chronicles and sermons as holy wars, marches of Christian knights to reclaim the Holy Land and defend the faith. Yet beneath the rhetoric of sanctity lay acts of brutality that were often silenced, softened, or entirely erased from the official record. The cover-ups were deliberate. To preserve the image of the Crusades as divinely ordained, chroniclers downplayed the atrocities that might tarnish the narrative of Christian heroism. The First Crusade of 1096 offers the starkest example. Contemporary accounts confirm that when Crusaders captured Jerusalem in July 1099, they massacred thousands of Muslims and Jews, blood filling the streets of the sacred city. Yet while some eyewitnesses described the carnage, later chronicles softened the detail, portraying the slaughter as a righteous purging rather than indiscriminate killing. The official tone shifted from horror to triumph, as if divine sanction had washed away the blood. Even earlier, during the march across Europe, bands of crusaders turned on Jewish communities in the Rhineland, Speyer, Worms, Mainz. Thousands were murdered in waves of violence that bore no connection to the journey east. And yet in the carefully curated chronicles produced in abbeys and courts, this episode was often absent. To admit that crusaders had butchered fellow subjects of the realm was politically dangerous, so silence served better than honesty. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 reveals another suppressed truth. Instead of reaching Jerusalem, crusaders sacked Constantinople, a Christian city. They looted relics, desecrated churches, and installed a short-lived Latin empire. This was a scandal for Christendom, yet many Western chroniclers framed it as a tragic accident, or avoided the subject altogether. The awkwardness of Christians slaughtering Christians sat uneasily with the official story of holy war, so memory was carefully reshaped into narrative convenience. There were smaller cover-ups too, chronicles extolling the bravery of the Crusader orders, the Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights, rarely mention their more ruthless campaigns. In the Baltic, for instance, the Teutonic Knights waged crusades against pagan Lithuanians, burning villages and enslaving survivors. German chronicles presented this as civilizing warfare, omitting the brutality. The silence framed conquest as evangelization, erasing the violence behind the cross. Curious fringe details sometimes leaked through. One account describes crusaders boiling the bodies of fallen comrades so they could transport their bones home as relics. Another speaks of heads displayed on spikes as trophies. These details survive on the margins of the record, hints of horrors that official histories muted. Why the cover-up? Partly it was propaganda. Rulers needed support for ongoing campaigns, and the Church required the Crusades to remain symbols of divine mission. Partly it was memory management. Societies cannot live forever with the burden of their own atrocities, but the silences distort history. By minimizing massacres, by framing looting as righteous, the record turns the Crusades into myths of chivalry rather than wars of conquest. And so, what survives is only half the story. The banners of the cross are remembered, the bloodstains beneath them are less so. Scholars still debate whether medieval chroniclers believed in their own silences, or whether they knowingly rewrote reality, shielding Christendom's self-image from the truth of its violence. The forgotten slave markets. When we picture medieval Europe, we often imagine castles, knights, and guild halls, not chains, markets, and human cargo. Yet slavery was far from absent. Across the Mediterranean, Eastern Europe, and even Western kingdoms, the buying and selling of people persisted, though official records frequently erased or euphemized the practice. To acknowledge the full scale of medieval slavery would have clashed with Christian ideals of brotherhood and undermined later myths of Europe as a society of freedom. Venice and Genoa, great maritime republics of the 12th and 13th centuries, were hubs not only of spice and silk, but of enslaved humans. Slavic captives from Eastern Europe, indeed the very word slave comes from Slav, were traded in their ports and shipped across the Mediterranean. Muslim captives taken in wars, or Africans transported through North Africa, were likewise sold into households. Yet when Venetian notaries recorded these transactions, they often used softened language: servants, dependents, domestics, a sanitized vocabulary masked the brutal reality. Even more striking is the evidence from England. While serfdom is often distinguished from slavery, charters and manorial records hint that true slavery persisted well into the 12th century. Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, lists thousands of slaves across the land, nearly 10% of the population. Yet later, English chronicles rarely acknowledge this fact, preferring to stress the gradual decline of bondage. The memory of outright slavery was scrubbed away, leaving the image of medieval England as a society of feudal obligation, not human trafficking. In the Islamic world, records are clearer, though Christian chroniclers often ignored them. The Mamluks of Egypt, for instance, rose from slave soldiers to rulers in the 13th century. Their very name, Mamluk, means owned, yet in Latin accounts their origins were downplayed. Better to describe them as exotic enemies than to admit that an empire could be ruled by former slaves, an unsettling reversal of Europe's hierarchies. Quirky details surface in scattered sources. Some chronicles mention white slaves from the Black Sea sold in Cairo, while others hint at eunuch markets supplying Byzantine courts. There are even references to enslaved scribes and clerks, highly educated yet bound in service. These glimpses disrupt the simple image of slavery as agricultural toil. In truth, it touched every layer of society. Why was so much forgotten? Partly it was embarrassment. By the later Middle Ages, Christian writers wanted to distinguish their society from the ancient Roman world, which they condemned for its dependence on slavery. Admitting that slavery endured into their own times blurred the line. Partly it was political convenience. Kingdoms and churches could not openly champion ideals of freedom and salvation while simultaneously profiting from markets in human beings. And so the record grew quiet. Slavery slipped into the background of manorial labour, crusader campaigns, and Mediterranean commerce. Only fragments survive in ship logs, merchant contracts, or incidental remarks from travellers. Scholars still debate whether this silence was simple neglect or a deliberate effort to cleanse Christendom's memory, ensuring that the medieval world appeared less complicit in the traffic of human lives than it truly was. The vanished pagan texts. Medieval Europe presented itself as the heir of Rome, yet it was also its censor. When Christianity became the dominant faith, vast libraries of pagan knowledge, philosophy, science, ritual, were at risk. Some works survived through careful copying by monks, but others were quietly suppressed, deemed dangerous, heretical, or simply unworthy of preservation. The cover-up was not always through fire and destruction, but often through silence, a deliberate refusal to copy texts, which in an age of manuscripts meant certain oblivion. Take the Sibylline books, once central to Roman religious prophecy. By late antiquity, references to them were scattered across Christian writings, yet by the Middle Ages, the texts themselves had disappeared. The reason was not accident alone. Copyists chose not to preserve them, since prophecy outside biblical authority was deemed corrupt. The gap in the record was intentional, leaving us with only whispers of what might have been. Even more tantalizing are the fragments of Greek and Roman science that vanished. We know that writers like Galen and Soranus produced vast medical treatises. Only a fraction survive. Some medieval physicians mention lost books by name, recalling knowledge once available but no longer copied. Did monasteries simply lack interest in these secular texts? Or did church authorities prefer to limit access to ideas that conflicted with theological teachings on the body and cosmos? Fringe details hint at stranger possibilities. Travellers in the 9th and 10th centuries claimed that hidden caches of pagan scrolls were stored in Byzantine or Arab libraries, off-limits to outsiders. A few whispered that Islamic Spain preserved works that Western Christendom had deliberately let fade away. Later, when Renaissance scholars rediscovered Aristotle or Plato, they marvelled at how close these treasures had come to total disappearance. In Northern Europe, pagan traditions faced similar erasure. Oral epics, rituals, and sacred songs of the Norse and Celtic peoples were rarely written down before Christianization. The little that survives, like the Icelandic Eddas, often comes from much later, already filtered through Christian scribes. What was lost is immeasurable. One monk, writing in 12th century Ireland, admitted that much of the ancient knowledge is gone because it was the work of demons. Such statements reveal how suppression could be couched as piety. And yet, traces linger in unexpected places. Marginal notes in manuscripts sometimes preserve a line of verse, a stray reference to a vanished book, or even a warning not to read a particular work. These tiny windows remind us that the Middle Ages was not an age of total ignorance, but one of selective memory. By shaping which voices survived, scribes curated the past as much as they recorded it. The silence around pagan texts continues to puzzle scholars. Was it mere neglect, a lack of time and resources? Or was it a conscious decision to erase rival worldviews, to ensure that Christianity alone could frame the intellectual inheritance of Europe? Either way, the cover-up worked. Whole libraries were reduced to dust and rumour, leaving us to reconstruct the forgotten wisdom of antiquity from fragments that survived only by accident, the buried Black Death truths. The Black Death of the mid-14th century remains one of the most catastrophic events in human history, wiping out perhaps a third of Europe's population. Yet the chronicles we rely on are often more notable for what they omit than for what they reveal. Silence cloaked the deeper truths of the plague, its origins, its transmission, and the uncomfortable realities of social breakdown that medieval elites preferred not to record. The official story, shaped in sermons and civic proclamations, cast the plague as divine punishment for sin. This was a convenient narrative. It placed blame on morality, not on rulers' failures to contain panic or provide aid. But beneath the surface, evidence suggests that authorities concealed more earthly causes. Maritime records hint that Venetian and Genoese merchants continued trading long after they knew ships carried death in their holds. To admit this would have meant confessing economic greed worsened the disaster. Equally troubling were the scapegoats. In many towns, Jewish communities were massacred, accused of poisoning wells. Yet in municipal archives, these pogroms are often absent, the memory deliberately erased. The silence was strategic. City councils preferred posterity to remember their defense against plague, not their complicity in mass murder. Only scattered Hebrew chronicles and a few candid Christian notes reveal the scale of this violence. Quirky fragments sometimes expose the cover-up. In one chronicle, a monk offhandedly mentions plague pits being filled with lime to mask the stench, evidence of mass graves that official city records never acknowledged. In another, a marginal note laments that priests refused to visit the dying, despite public claims of their bravery. These glimpses reveal the gap between propaganda and reality. The medical profession, too, was compromised. University FD. Here says, Accoltes compiled learned treatises blaming corrupted air or astrological alignments, yet recent analysis of these same manuscripts shows deliberate excision of sections that speculated about contagion between humans. Why omit them? Perhaps because acknowledging person-to-person spread would have forced authorities to admit failure in quarantine measures. Better to frame the plague as cosmic fate than a crisis of policy. Even the death toll itself was manipulated. Some town registers undercounted burials, noting only those in consecrated ground. But archaeologists uncovering plague pits today find layers of bodies unrecorded. Scholars still debate whether this was bureaucratic oversight or conscious denial, a way for rulers to project stability in the face of collapse. The Black Death transformed Europe, upending feudal structures, reshaping economies, and altering religious life. Yet much of what we know comes filtered through narratives crafted for survival and reputation. The cover-ups were not only about hiding horror, but about shaping memory. Rulers, priests, and chroniclers wanted posterity to see endurance, not panic, faith, not fury, order, not chaos. Still, the silences speak loudly. In the gaps between records, in the bones unearthed from forgotten pits, in the whispered fragments of marginalized voices, we glimpse truths that chroniclers sought to bury. Scholars still debate whether medieval society could have faced its darkest hour with honesty, or whether rewriting the plague into a tale of divine punishment was the only way it could endure. The suppressed witch trials. When we imagine witch trials, our minds leap to the bonfires of early modern Europe or the infamous events of Salem. But long before those, in the medieval centuries, communities whispered of witches, sorcery, and night flights. What is remarkable is not that such beliefs existed, but that their official suppression was uneven, often hidden, and later rewritten into a simpler narrative of persecution. In truth, medieval witch trials were sporadic, localized, and, crucially, covered up when they conflicted with church teaching. In the early Middle Ages, church authorities often dismissed witchcraft accusations as superstition. A famous canon from the 10th century, the Canon Episcopi, declared that women who claimed to fly with the goddess Diana were deluded, victims of the devil's trickery rather than real witches. Yet archaeological finds and folkloric traces suggest that communities did in fact accuse and sometimes punish supposed witches. These events, however, rarely made it into official records. To admit they occurred would contradict the Church's own teaching that witches were illusions. One curious episode surfaces in the archives of northern Italy. A woman accused of brewing storms to destroy crops was quietly executed, yet the trial documents were later destroyed, leaving only a passing mention in a bishop's letter. Elsewhere, in Germany, charters show sudden confiscations of land from women accused of sorcery, but without any accompanying trial record. It is as if communities carried out punishments, but chroniclers preferred not to commit them to parchment. Quirky details crop up in folklore collections. In some alpine villages, old songs recall the burning of the herb women, though local church documents insist no such trials took place. In this way, oral tradition preserves what written history attempted to erase, it suggests. Estis that cover-ups were not about denying which beliefs existed, but about controlling how they were remembered. By the 13th and 14th centuries, as inquisitors expanded their reach, witchcraft accusations began to merge with heresy. Yet even here, inconsistencies abound. Papal bulls thundered against sorcery, but inquisitorial manuals, like Bernard Guy's, made surprisingly little mention of witches compared to heretics. It seems that local officials sometimes inflated the threat of witches for political or economic reasons, then downplayed or destroyed records once the frenzy cooled. Why this selective memory? Partly, it was embarrassment. Theological authorities wished to present the medieval church as rational, superior to pagan superstition. To admit widespread witch hunts before the witch craze of the 15th and 16th centuries would tarnish that narrative. Partly, it was politics. Acknowledging that communities executed witches without sanction risked exposing fissures in church authority. Modern historians debate the scope of medieval witch trials. Were they rare exceptions, exaggerated in folklore, or were they more common, later erased to preserve the illusion of a consistent, rational church doctrine? The fragments we do have, odd confessions of night flights, unexplained property confiscations, stray notes of burnings, suggest that far more happened than official accounts allow. In the silence of erased trials, we hear the hum of fear, rumour, and community violence that was never meant to reach posterity. What survives is a medieval world more unsettled than the neat chronicles suggest, a world where faith, superstition and secrecy intertwined, and where witch trials existed in shadow, suppressed before they could enter the official record. The Lost Voyages. Medieval maps are famous for their blank spaces, for seas filled with dragons and lands marked simply, "Here be monsters." Yet hidden beneath those silences lies another story, voyages taken, contacts made, and knowledge deliberately withheld or forgotten. These lost voyages are not mere fantasy. Scattered clues suggest that medieval travellers reached farther than official chronicles admit, and that their journeys were quietly erased from memory. Take the Norse. We know from archaeology at Land's O Meadows in Newfoundland that Leif Erikson and his kin reached North America around the year 1000. Yet for centuries, this astonishing feat barely appeared in European records. Icelandic sagas tell the tale, but even these were copied sparingly, almost as if later scribes feared their credibility. In the wider medieval world, the voyages simply disappeared. To acknowledge them would complicate the narrative of Europe's discovery centuries later. Then there are the Welsh legends of Prince Madoc, said to have sailed west across the Atlantic in the 12th century. While mainstream historians doubt his expedition, later explorers in the Americas encountered native groups with traditions of pale strangers arriving long before Columbus. Did these stories preserve some trace of an erased contact, or were they convenient myths crafted to claim precedence in the age of exploration? Scholars still debate whether such tales reflect real voyages or later inventions retrofitted into medieval memory. Closer to the Mediterranean, Arab and Islamic sailors may have fared even farther. Records from the court of Cordoba hint at expeditions into the Atlantic, seeking islands of the blessed. A 9th century geographer, al-Mas'udi, wrote cryptically of a voyage that returned after discovering strange coasts to the west. Yet these accounts were often dismissed as marvels rather than geography, sidelined until they faded into obscurity. Quirky details abound. A map preserved in Venice marks an island far to the west labelled Antillia, centuries before Europeans officially recorded such lands. In another, an Irish monk jots a note about sailed beyond the world's edge, possibly referencing Atlantic crossings. Were these mistakes or faint traces of real knowledge suppressed because they defied prevailing world views? Why the cover-ups? Partly it was about narrative control. The medieval order prized stability. Admitting that far-off voyages had found new worlds might raise uncomfortable questions about the limits of Christendom, about peoples and lands beyond biblical geography. Better to let such tales sink into silence than risk destabilizing theology and politics. Later, when the Age of Discovery dawned, it was more useful to paint Columbus and his peers as pioneers than to admit others had come before. The Lost Voyages remind us that the medieval world was not as small or as insular as we often imagine. Sailors, traders, monks, and adventurers pushed boundaries, left traces, and sometimes returned with stories too disruptive to keep alive. The silence was itself a form of control, an attempt to keep the map of the world aligned with the map of belief. Scholars still debate whether the Norse, the Welsh, or the Muslim navigators deserve credit for reaching across the ocean first. What we can say is this: the journeys happened in some form, and the cover-ups ensured that they would be half-remembered legends rather than fully acknowledged history. In the medieval imagination, some truths were simply too vast to fit within the parchment margins. Conclusion. Across 20 chapters, we have wandered through the hidden corridors of medieval history, tracing cover-ups that reshaped memory itself. From forged charters to silenced witch trials, from lost pagan texts to voyages erased from maps, the Middle Ages emerges not as a dark age of ignorance, but as an age of selective remembrance. Power lay not only in armies or crowns, but in the quill. in the choice of what to copy, what to bury, what to leave unsaid. What these stories reveal is that history is never simply what happened, it is what was allowed to survive. The medieval world, like our own, curated its past to suit its present. And in the silence of vanished texts, hidden bones, and erased maps, we glimpse how much has been lost, how much rewritten. These cover-ups do not merely obscure history, they reshape it. And perhaps by uncovering them, we come closer to understanding the truths that linger between the lines,